Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Paul Israel, Executive Director of the Israel Australia Chamber of Commerce, and I'm talking to you from my home in Rehovot, 20k south of Tel Aviv. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural joint IACC Australian Business Council Dubai UAE webinar. Ever since the Abraham Accords were signed, my LinkedIn feed is full of daily updates of Israelis in my network visiting the UAE, shaking hands with locals. It's really terrific to witness. And today's webinar is about us doing our bit to show support of these newly established ties. We have a terrific panel of speakers from Israel, the UAE, and Australia. But first, I want to introduce the IACC for those that aren't familiar. The Israel Australia Chamber of Commerce is an independent, non-profit organization dedicated to the promotion of bilateral trade and relations. We have 5 sister chambers in Australia. Until Corona hit, our main activity was hosting business delegations. In 2019, we organized 40 such missions. And in 2020, we were expected to host 50 delegations. That is over 1,000 people per annum. Our delegations are diverse in nature and include business people, C-level executives from Australia's largest companies, entrepreneurs, investors, academics, government officials, but of course, all that now has been put on hold. Since Corona entered our lives, we have turned our attention to webinars and virtual missions, plus conducting a lot of technology scouting. That is helping Australian companies get access to the unique and vibrant Israeli high-tech ecosystem, looking at topics such as big data, AI, cyber, robotics, telecommunications, fintech, property and construction tech, energy, retail tech, agri-tech, biotech, and more. It is now my pleasure to ask Carl Dowling, the chairman of the Australian Business Council Dubai, to say a few words. But before I hand over the mic to Carl, I do want to thank him and Lisa Melly from the Business Council, as they were the ones that initiated the first contact between our two organizations, a new connection which we're very excited about. They've been excellent to work with, and I want to thank them personally. Over to you, Carl. You're on mute, Carl.
Sorry, with the mute button. That's a good start. No, thank you very much, Paul, and really appreciate the warm words. I would have to echo the same. Since the signing of the Accord, which I think has taken many of us by surprise, but it's been a fantastic development, not just for the UAE, but the Middle East on the whole. We've already seen, I'm sure many of the attendees today would know of many other states that are looking to echo the same normalisation of ties, which has been a fantastic step. I think we're all very proud in the UAE to have been at the forefront of it. And it does open up a massive amount of opportunities for the two-way trade. What you have are two states that have excellence in different fields, and notwithstanding some of our speakers today, of course, the technological advances that Israel offers to the UAE market is fantastic, fantastic opportunity, not just for Israeli companies looking at the market here, but for the UAE companies that want to look at taking up their businesses, which in the COVID age is a must-have. So since the signing of the Accord, we have reached out to IACC just to develop a relationship, as we feel that both members from IACC and the ABCD will find opportunities between the two markets. And very quickly, Paul and his team were kind enough to jump on pulling this first webinar together, the first of many that we'll be holding over the next coming months, where we will start to deep dive into potentially industry specific sectors or topics that will hopefully help our members bridge the gap. For the IACC members that are logged in this morning, thank you for joining. The Australian Business Council of Dubai has been operating for 26 years. We are not-for-profit. The formation of private chambers of commerce, you only have a chamber within each emirate. All geographical associations are just registered as not-for-profits. We work very closely with Dubai Chamber and many other government authorities. In fact, I can say very proudly, earlier this year, we held the first virtual trade mission for the Dubai government into Australia, where they were advertising, of course, where the opportunities lie in Dubai. But that will be enough from me today. I'll hand it back to Paul to introduce some of our Israeli speakers, but hopefully there's good value for all the attendees today, and we'll see you at the next ones coming as well.
Thanks, Carl. So I want to take a moment and tell you about the Israeli speakers we have for you today. We're very privileged to have two senior partners from one of Israel's leading law firms, Pearl Cohen, Anna Moshe and Micha Tolman. Pearl Cohen have been solid chamber supporters over many years, hosting a large number of our delegations and missions in what must be the nicest boardroom in Israel, as you can see behind Micha there. Both Anna and Micha are respected experts in their field and both have meaningful connections with Australia. We have Mike Granoff from Maniv, one of the world's largest VCs focusing on mobility. Mike is a real pioneer in the Israeli business community. And whilst it was a surprise to hear that Maniv are the first VC to make an investment into UAE, it does not come as a shock that Mike was responsible for making that happen. We will hear about the Maniv investment into UAE later on. And in Sydney, we have Guy Abelson from iInterview, an Australian-Israeli startup focusing on a video platform, putting personality back into hiring. And as far as the Chamber is aware, this is the only Australian company with an Israeli R&D centre of any significance. Carl and I will be moderating the webinar in an informal format, asking each of our panelists a series of questions. I now hand over to Carl to talk about the UAE speakers. Thank you.
Thank you again, Paul. I will quickly run through the introductions so we can get going, as we hope that the questions we ask today will give a good insight into the trading environment and opportunities that lie within. But first and foremost, I'd like to introduce Stephen McKenna. Stephen works with Clyde & Co, which is one of the largest foreign law firms operating in the UAE and very well respected. Stephen has been working in the Middle East since 2009. So thank you very much for joining us today, Stephen. The second speaker will be Krista Fox, owner and founder of Changeosity. She has been working in the Middle East for, I have to ask for your forgiveness, Krista, but I'd say decades now. Been a long-term member of the Australian Business and a fellow board member. But Changeosity has been fantastic at developing Krista's expertise in leadership and culture development. And the third speaker, which is in partnership, I believe, with Mike from Maniv, is Jaideep Dhanoa. Jaideep is the founder and CEO of Phoenix Micromobility Scooters. Phoenix, as Paul mentioned, is the first recipient of a direct private investment from an Israeli VC fund. And I do believe it is the highest valuation of a startup in UAE history. So a few milestones to stand there. And the micro-mobility space was a word I had to look up when I first met Jaideep, but I've learned a lot about it since, and we'll learn a little bit more further today. Thanks very much.
So Carl, so now we'll ask each of the speakers just to briefly introduce themselves and talk about their businesses. So back to you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you to the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce and the Australia Business Council, Dubai, for hosting this event. I'll quickly introduce myself, Pearl Cohen, just a quick touch on the Israeli economy and certain opportunities that I see. My connection to this event is I actually started my legal career in Australia. I practiced with Baker McKenzie and Linklaters in Sydney in the infrastructure practice groups there. And today I manage the infrastructure practice group at Pearl Cohen. I returned to Tel Aviv in 2011. And at that time, it was an exciting time between the Australian economy and, its aspirations with respect to Israel, because the Australian economy was realizing that it can't continue relying on natural resources and it needs to become a more innovative industry. And as a result, the Australian government, targeted 5 different locations worldwide with thriving innovative industries: Israel, San Fran, Berlin, Singapore, London. And following this initiative, we just started, as Paul was saying, seeing many, many delegations from Australia come to Israel to experience the startup nation and see it up front and close. And I was very privileged to be in the position of someone who had just returned from Australia, knew the Australian landscape and how things were done, and show these Australian, investors, financiers, companies, the Israeli innovative spirit, the tech scene in Israel, and witnessed and accompanied some great transactions of Australians investing into Israeli technology, different forms of collaborations. We saw the landing pad and so forth. I know that I'm really excited now, following the Abraham Accords, to see the same spirit from the UAE towards Israel. I mean, the ink hasn't dried, and the amount of webinars and already delegations, putting COVID aside, show the excitement and the potential between UAE and Israel, and I'm sure we're going to see many more of this. Very briefly about Pearl Cohn, we're an international law firm. We're based in Tel Aviv, Israel thriving commercial center, Haifa, New York, Boston, LA, and London. On the Australian front, we've got a very active Australia desk, which is led by my partner, Anna Moshe. She'll speak on that. I think it's fair to say today that we're probably the leading firm on ASX IPOs, which is a form for Australians to invest in Israeli early stage companies. We've got many Hebrew and Arabic native speakers at the firm, and our Arabic native speakers are very excited about the potential to start seeing deal flow with the UAE, even though we know everything's in English, but it's still very exciting. And just generally, we like to consider ourselves a firm that really knows to help foreign and international clients break into the Israeli culture, economy, and immerse in the relevant business opportunities. So putting legal aside, we're very happy to be in touch with everyone here. If you require any intros, leads, just questions about the Israeli economy, by all means, drop us a line. Very broadly about Israel. So whilst Israel is a thriving technology bubble, and is known to be the startup nation, it is also a developing country. It's got a growing economy. A lot of the infrastructure in the country was, set up back in the day when the British Mandate was here, and is regularly having to be, refurbished and upgraded, as well as we're having to introduce new infrastructure and utilities to support the startup nation. That's my practice. I act for contractors, financiers, state, both international, local, delivering, the leading Israeli infrastructure projects. And I mention this because I know that since signing the Accords, there've been dozens of webinars on technology and startup. And I'd actually like to present on what we call the old school opportunities, classic infrastructure and construction projects, because the economy here is booming in that space. And startups aside, the real catalyzer of the economy in Israel are the infrastructure and the construction space. When I
Thanks, Micha.
Yeah.
That's great. So we'll touch on those later on. Thank you,
Great.
Micha. We'll now go to Steve McKenna from Clyde & Co.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks very much for both organisations for inviting me along today. My name is Stephen McKenna. I'm coming to you from Abu Dhabi, in the capital of the UAE today. Good morning to those in the UAE and Israel, and good evening to those in Australia. I come from Clyde & Co. We are the largest law firm in the Middle East, and we help guide our clients through the full investment cycle from cradle to grave, so to speak. I'm a corporate lawyer, so I specialize in, I suppose, the front end, dealing in M&A, joint ventures, and particularly foreign investment. And what I do on a day-to-day basis is guide foreign investors through the potential hurdles in the UAE when you come to doing investment, doing business, and through sometimes what can be unfamiliar territory. So that's my day-to-day job. I should mention that Clyde & Co. not only has 5 offices in the region, but we also have offices in all the major cities in Australia as well. So together with our whole host of other offices throughout the world, we have full global coverage, which I think is really important in this international day and age. If we take a look at the UAE and what's happening here, it's no surprise that there has been a contraction in the economy over the last year or so. That said, there is expected growth of about 2.5% into 2022, as per the World Bank, which is, very welcomed. I think if we look at some of the government support that has been mitigating some of the crisis factors we've been facing here. We also look at potentially higher oil prices, increased demand, increased capacity, and improved business sentiment, together with opportunities like Dubai Expo 2021 now, not 2020 as it was. For me, this means that there are plenty of opportunities, particularly following the signing of the Abraham Accords between the UAE, Israel, and also for Australian companies. We have heard about and how important that is, and how it's kind of the talking point at the moment. We also see an uptick in trade, but touching on what Micha was saying, we do see opportunity in the infrastructure space as well. If you look at the investments that are made regionally by governments, that hasn't fallen off. You look at some of the projects like new airports, new Etihad rail network, and for example the Abu Dhabi Metro, which are all coming along, which I think represent solid opportunities, which of course feeds into the foreign direct investment, which I'll touch on in a little more detail as we go throughout the session.
Thanks, Stephen. Great to hear the positive news from the economy in your direction. And if anything, I think we'll get first prize for the diverse accents we're going to have on this webinar. So thank you, Stephen. We'll now move to Mike Granoff from Maniv Mobility. Thanks, Mike.
Hi, Mike Granoff. I'm from Tel Aviv, and I'm a venture capitalist in Israel, even though 8 years ago I didn't think I'd be either of those things. From the New York area, came to Israel for a year with the family, but kids didn't want to leave, so we stayed. And I had been involved in a number of things around what I call energy security. In the American context, it really means reducing the monopoly impact of oil on transportation. It's the sort of impact on geopolitics and macroeconomics. And so I got obsessed in a period about 15 years ago with electric vehicles, and with the idea that electric vehicles ultimately would be inevitable as technology reduced the price of energy storage, but that it was in everyone's interest for that to be accelerated. And in the context of a company I was involved with for several years, A Better Place, I made, that was a company based in Israel, but also operated in Australia. Now was the time I had an opportunity to visit there. When I came to Israel, the mobility sector was really beginning to take off. Mobileye, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, had already gone public and later got acquired by Intel in the largest acquisition of an Israeli company ever, $15 billion. And of course, Waze, that's ubiquitous in all of our lives, had been purchased by Google a couple years earlier. But it turned out those were just harbingers of literally hundreds of startups in the mobility space in Israel that came along in the years that followed. I started helping some of them out, and that kind of morphed into helping them out with funding from other parties, and that sort of turned me into a venture capitalist I hadn't intended to be. But it's worked out well, and we still think that the digitization of transportation, which is really what we're seeing now after having seen information and communication get digitized, that digitization is really in the early days. And it involves electrification, but also involves different types of form factors and giving people the opportunity to purchase trips, not just to purchase a vehicle every 4 or 5 years that takes you on all the trips, diverse as they are. So that's a quick overview. Maniv manages about $150 million. Our investors include a lot of the world's large auto companies. And we invest in Israel, but also all over the world, as we're discussing today.
Fantastic. So Mike, thank you. Just your audio and video is a bit shaky, so I don't know if you can improve it at all in the time we've got, but it got stalled a few times. Thanks, Mike. Over to Jaydeep from Phoenix.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, distinguished panel, for having us in this session. Good morning, good afternoon to all the guests. So briefly on myself and our company, I'm not Israeli or Australian or Emirati, but I have many friends, and I'm Indian, American, but I'm a byproduct of the UAE system. I went to high school here. I moved here in '97. Family's been here 24 years. I spent 11 years here and was fortunate to work in a few other ecosystems in the Valley, in New York, in Singapore, and India. and before coming back to UAE. I've been a leader in the mobility space for a number of years, first with Careem, which was acquired by Uber for 3.1 billion about a year and a half ago. Later with Grab in Southeast Asia, and then as a pioneer creating the micromobility industry in the Middle East with a company called Circ, which was acquired earlier this year by Bird. I've since co-founded Phoenix. We are a very early stage company. We are a micromobility service focused on the Middle East market. When we say micromobility, we mean single passenger vehicles optimized for short distance trips. They could be electric scooters, electric bikes, mopeds, other form factors to be discovered and developed. And we are also, the first direct beneficiaries of the Abraham Accords from a startup tech ecosystem perspective, right? So many have kind of took the leap of faith and crossed the chasm and invested in Phoenix just last month, right? So we can talk more about that in the coming discussion.
Thanks very much, Jaideep. Guy, if you could please give yourself an introduction.
Sure, thanks, Carl. Hi, everybody. My name's Guy. Really a pleasure to be here today, and thanks so much for the opportunity to speak. So as Paul touched on before, I'm the co-founder of MyInterview. MyInterview is a video interview platform. We're all focused about revealing the personality behind the resume. We know it's really difficult to be able to distinguish who a particular candidate is when they're applying for a job, and a resume only scratches the surface to a candidate's motivations, skills, and capabilities. So this is why MyInterview was born. It was based off my personal experience. I did a Bachelor of Business in Computer Science at university, and then found it really hard to kind of crack into the job field because my resume looked almost identical to my business partner, Benji, who's based out of Tel Aviv. So this is why MyInterview was born. And the way MyInterview works is it's a video interview platform where companies can sign up. It's a SaaS model. We have about 2,000 companies globally using our product. They can set up interview questions where candidates can click on their mobile, desktop, or tablet, respond anytime, anywhere, and they can convey their motivations, their skills, they can demonstrate experience or knowledge for a particular role. And then we can promote companies the ability to collaborate and review these interviews anytime and anywhere as well. We also have an AI element that sits in our product to understand a little bit more about a candidate's interview, where we focus on the text and the transcript and the tone of the interview. And we help companies basically get a signal as to which particular candidate that's applied might suit certain roles in the company. So if it's a customer service role or if it's a sales role. A little bit about MyInterview as well. So we're one of the first companies to actually go through the Australian landing pad. So we're an Australian company, or depending on how you pronounce it. Majority of our team's actually based in Tel Aviv these days. And we went through the landing pad in 2016. We've had a phenomenal year this year. We've had about a 500% uplift in growth. And this culminated in last week, whereby we announced basically our $5 million seed round led by Aleph, which is a preeminent VC in Israel. And we're quite unique in the space that we have a presence in Australia, and obviously we have a presence in Israel. But more importantly, and across the region, we're really proud of the Abraham Accords. We're looking fortunate to be able to do two things. One, promote MyInterview to quite big labor markets that sit across the UAE. We know there are a lot of different people looking for work in these markets. We know they're not afraid to take on new technologies and to embrace new ways. And we see it a fantastic opportunity for MyInterview to be able to offer our services. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Guy. Very interesting between you and Jaideep. I'm just going to have to try and keep up with the technology conversation. But thank you very much. Krista, if you could please introduce yourself and Changeosity.
Thanks, Carl. And it's a pleasure to join the discussion today. So as Carl mentioned, Changeosity is a boutique strategy and leadership advisory firm. We've been running for just over a year now, based in Dubai, but serving companies and leaders across the GCC. But prior to that, I led the transformation of one of the key economic zones in the UAE, and that was focused very much on growing trade. So I'm really interested to be in this conversation today, particularly around the technology side. But what that did was really created a passion for transformation leadership, and I co-founded Changeosity just over a year ago. Our focus is on leaders, and we're passionate about creating better leaders who themselves then create better organisations. We believe that there's a real trend of and a real shift happening in leadership in this region. The approach is changing, and we're seeing the adoption of more people-focused leadership, which is really resulting in the adoption of innovation, but also transformation of culture in organisations. We think it's a very good time to be talking about leadership and collaborating across borders. And it's a huge opportunity to welcome knowledge and insights from the Israeli business community. So I'll speak more about leadership a little bit later through this session. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Krista. And last but not least, Stephen, if you please introduce yourself and Clyde and Co.
Well, I think I might skip on to the actual options from setting up in the UAE, because I think I've probably covered the intro a little bit earlier. So it can be a bit of a minefield, but don't let you put you off, because it is a country and a region with fantastic opportunities that I'm sure all the panelists will vouch. I'm not going to intend to cover everything or all the options that are available, because that would be a webinar in itself. Just to give you an idea, there are approximately 40 different jurisdictions that you can register your company or set up your business in the UAE. So there are similarities, but there are also a lot of differences. What I'm going to do today is touch on what are essentially two of the broader options, which is setting up onshore in the UAE and setting up in the free zone. One thing to point out at the very outset, there is no such thing as a UAE-wide commercial or business operating license, which is something that is unfortunately misunderstood quite a lot. So looking at the two options, so onshore, you may have seen recent press coverage that changes are afoot, which mean that the way is paved for 100% foreign ownership for onshore companies. Onshore companies typically require a 51% local shareholder. I would caveat that by saying yes, the law has been announced and amended, but we don't see the practical changes possibly coming through until the end of Q1 2021. So I'm going to talk about what is the old regime, which is basically the requirement to have a 51% shareholder to operate onshore. And by what I mean onshore is basically everywhere that is not a free zone within a particular emirate. Your options are a limited liability company or a branch of a foreign company. Both have pros and cons, but it's important to know those pros and cons before you essentially sign up to anything. And as I said, I could spend a lot more time on this, but this is a really high-level summary. When you look at a free zone, you have the same options really, which is a branch of a foreign company or a limited liability company. The only difference is that with the free zone, 100% foreign ownership is permitted. That has been long since the case, and that's why many of the free zones are so attractive for foreign companies investing into the UAE. However, it comes with a catch. By having your operations in a free zone, having your company established in a free zone, it means that strictly speaking, your activities and your staff are limited to working within that geographical free zone. So something to bear in mind, particularly if you are interested in the UAE, sometimes there's a little bit of misinformation in the market about what you can and can't do being a free zone company. So important to know where the rules and regulations are, make sure you don't end up in trouble. One other point I'm going to touch on, but not in detail, is agency. Agency is something that has been around for quite a while, which is basically a way that a foreign company can have a local agent to promote and sell its products or services in market on the foreign company's behalf. Please do not sign any form of agency agreement without having someone else look at it, because if you do, you may potentially fall into what is quite a protective regime for your local agent under the Commercial Agencies Law. So just one thing to point out, not as popular as they used to be, but again, would be remiss of me not to put that up as a warning sign.
Thanks, Stephen. And 40 jurisdictions sounds like a bit of a challenge, but I'm glad that you've got your head around it. A question now for Micha from Pearl Cohen. What opportunities do you see for UAE companies in the various Israeli infrastructure projects you touched on earlier?
Thank you, Paul. So first, I think we've already seen, Israel shipyards team up with Dubai Ports World in a bid for the Haifa port. And much of what we're seeing in the Israeli infrastructure space is the privatization of existing infrastructures in Israel. And just like Dubai Ports World have teamed up with an Israeli company to try and bid on the Haifa port, there are quite a few other opportunities like that, which in my view are very exciting opportunities. The Israel Electricity Corporation, which basically has a monopoly on the electricity industry in Israel, is looking to privatize approximately 4,500 megawatts of conventional power stations through the sale of these power plants. And this privatization process initially comprised the acquisition and operation of 5 large-scale conventional power plants. 3 of these power plants are still up for sale. Relevantly, the next power plant is called Hagit, that is in the northern district of Israel. We're looking at approximately 600 megawatts of to be sold there. Additionally, Reading power plant is going to be sold in 2021. Reading is probably the largest power plant in Israel, in Tel Aviv, and that's a huge opportunity for a Dubai-based company to team up with an Israeli company. We've already seen foreign companies bidding on the acquisition of power plants in Israel, and some have actually been successful. And we've also now got the next power plant in Ashdod, the Eshkol power plant, which will be sold in 2022. So I think these are the first, key opportunities here. If you want to enter the Israeli market, as we say, on the safe bets in the infrastructure space, not through the development and construction of projects, but actually getting a utility that's already in operation. Additionally, the rail sector in Israel is booming. Typically, the infrastructure projects delivered in Israel take the space of either straight contracting, PPPs, and then just very early stage opportunities for engineering companies. We've currently got the Jerusalem Blue Line. That's literally PQs around the corner, and same goes for Haifa Nazareth PPP. But there's still opportunity there for Dubai-based financiers. We've got the Tel Aviv Metro project. I know Stefan mentioned it earlier that they've got that in Dubai. That's kicking off in Israel. That's a project where they've allocated approximately $40 billion over the next 10 years to kickstart. We've currently got the engineering phase tenders coming out. We've got a new PPP rail project in Beersheba that's going to connect Beersheba to some of the surrounding cities down south. And a few other mass rail projects down south. Another space in Israel that's going through a major reform and where there's great opportunity is the renewable energy space, especially following COVID-19 and some recessionary pressures that were felt in Israel. The government is looking at infrastructure to stimulate the economy again and is targeting 80% of electricity consumption at high demand from renewable sources by the end of the decade. That means we're looking at approximately 16,000 megawatts in the next decade, budgeted at give or take 25 billion US. Renewable energy, and generally speaking, energy in Israel is a pretty safe bet. Israel is expected to grow at approximately 4% in the next coming years, based, on the fact that our population is expected to be 15 million by 2048, 10 million in 2024. That's an increase of, 1 million from what we are today by 2024. The electricity demand per capita is currently, 2,100 kilowatts per annum, expected to grow to 5,500. So we're expecting to see by 2030 an additional 6,000 to 7,000 megawatts, just on a new renewable projects. Additionally, we've got exciting aviation opportunities. They're looking at a new airport in Ramat David that's going to take the form of a PPP. That's still early days, and the PQ should be published in the next couple of weeks, months. We've obviously, you know, a leading country in desalination. We've got 2 large desalination projects in the north of Israel. And additionally, you know, in the last decade, we've had the exciting discovery of the offshore gas fields. And I know that the Israeli, you know, offshore gas players are already looking and in touch with some of the, you know, large players in the UAE. So those are opportunities to be aware of. I spoke about what we call the old world classic construction infrastructure opportunities. Another space that my partner Anna Moshe will touch on, which is thriving in Israel, is what we call construction tech and prop tech, which is the immersion of new construction technologies, which have literally, you know, been lagging behind compared to other industries, into the construction and infrastructure space in Israel. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Amazing amount of opportunities there. Now, if I could please throw a question to Mike. Can you just, in your own words, describe your first trip to the UAE, as it's the newest travel corridor in the world, I think. Can you tell us what led you to Phoenix? Was there a specific rationale behind pursuing a UAE startup as opposed to other opportunities elsewhere? Was there a thirst to really try and get into the market sooner than later? Just your mindset would be fantastic.
Sure. So I had never been to UAE before the announcement of the normalization with Israel. And what struck me is that in the days following the announcement, you know, my LinkedIn started to fill up with connections from the region. And, you know, this was like, I could tell within 24 hours that this was going to be a very different kind of peace than what we have with Jordan and Egypt. And that this was, in fact, you know, going to be an opportunity on lots of levels, and that has borne itself out to a much greater degree than I could ever have imagined. I was lucky enough within just a couple of weeks of the announcement to have the opportunity to go. Actually, it's just sort of latch onto a friend who was taking a small delegation, and as luck and fate would have it, JD reached out to us just a week or so before that visit. And we know the scooter business very well. It's one of the things we followed very closely around the world. So we have opinions about it. We kind of knew what to look for and knew the characteristics of a market that'll be successful. And in fact, we have one right outside my window here in Tel Aviv, which by some accounts might be one of the more profitable markets for the scooter companies that are operating here. And it turns out, you know, that not surprisingly, a lot of the characteristics that we see here are shared in the Gulf region. So we were immediately intrigued by Phoenix, and it was very fortuitous that I had the opportunity to meet JD just days after he reached out on my visit to Dubai, and that we were able in the weeks that followed to come to an agreement for the investment. But to just answer your question about the visit a little more broadly, you know, I was just overwhelmed by the warmth of the people who I met, and the sense of curiosity and respect. You know, it was a lot more than just, you know, what are the business opportunities here. It was like, what are the people-to-people opportunities? And I actually got put into a WhatsApp group that has about 50 Israelis of various backgrounds and 50 Emiratis, also a very diverse bunch. And, you know, for the last couple of months, that group goes 24/7, talking about everything under the sun. No subject is out of bounds. It could be politics or religion or culture or recipes. It's the warmth there is every Friday we get Shabbat Shalom from our friends in the Emirates, and it's really it's just been tremendous sort of get an eye into the UAE in that way. So can't say enough on every level about this relationship. It's definitely the best thing that happened in a year that a lot of other things a lot of us would like to forget.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mike. I can honestly say from living in the UAE for many years, if WhatsApp goes down, the UAE suffers. We live on WhatsApp here.
Israel as well. No wonder we get along so well.
So we love a WhatsApp group. So no, it's good. It's an easy way to communicate. It's actually quite fantastic. Thank you so much, Mike. So now on to Jaideep with a very similar question, but from the opposite side. So as you set up the business quite recently, it's very, very new. And I know you were on the hunt for funding and you were looking in the UAE. What made you think about Israel? Was it, as Mike said, a fortuitous encounter or contact from previous life? Or did you actually seek it as a strategic partnership, possibly from technology side of things?
Yeah, sure. And I guess let me speak as an entrepreneur, right? I mean, this peace accord has really been a game changer for the UAE ecosystem. And, you know, I hope and I expect that you know, there'll be many more investments from Israel VCs into this region, and it won't be newsworthy in the future, right? Personally, right, as an entrepreneur, we're looking for value-adding investors, right? Who can best support our mission and our success, probability of success, right? And the ecosystem here is still, here I mean in the UAE, is still, I would say, emerging, right? There's not a long history of venture investments and experienced VC firms. There's not a large history of meaningful outcomes either, right? And so when you look at the flywheel of like talent and capital and experience and culture, right? We're still, you know, in the early stages of that flywheel for the ecosystem, which we've seen kind of accelerate in other geographies, and I mean UAE is on the right track, right? And when we look at Israel, it is, you know, it is one of the top tech ecosystems in the world, right? And I think due to, you know, also due to the politics, I mean, the companies there have had to go global from day one, right? and that's something that we can really learn from here in the UAE, right? Where we really build for our local market first. So when it came to like working with Maniv and working with you know, an Israeli VC, we weren't looking for Israeli capital. We were just looking for, you know, experienced capital, and it just so happened now with the Accords we had access to, you know, a lot of experienced investors that, you know, were out of reach previously, right? And mobility, you know, funds. I mean, there are not that many of them in the world with the track record of Maniv, right? And with the network and depth of domain knowledge, right? And so as a mobility focused startup, I mean, it's a great fit. And there's probably like a dozen like Maniv equivalents in Israel, you know, that have like depth of sector experience, you know, have invested in the space previously, whether it's cybersecurity or, you know, the agri-tech or maybe other topics, right? That, you know, those sorts of domain startups here can benefit from. And I think that was really the background for why we reached out, and why I think it's a great fit. I mean, entrepreneurs are going to be greedy, right? They're going to look for the best capital they can get.
Thank you, Jaideep. As a user of one of your scooters, highly recommended. I think it's a great opportunity. But going back to Mike, just in terms of, so Maniv has had the opportunity to invest in Phoenix micromobility. It's huge. It's a brand new market. Are you looking at other investment opportunities inside the UAE? Are there any other sectors or potential opportunities that are coming away? Because one thing about the UAE is that it has been a very difficult market for any startup to get funding. It's incredibly difficult. So you might get swamped more so, depending on how you answer the question. But yeah, it'd be interesting to know if you're looking at a broader space or what kind of areas.
As JD implied, we're a very sector-specific fund. So we're called Mediva Mobility. We don't have venture in our name. We don't have capital in our name. We have mobility in our name. Would we look at other mobility opportunities in UAE? Of course. And we have had a few come through since. We get a lot of opportunities from all over the world coming in every day. So there are only a handful that we can really follow up on very specifically, as with any fund. But we have had some more interesting things come in from the region since, and as JD was just alluding to, I think their ecosystem is really just getting started. I think that there's tremendous talent there that's going to get unleashed, and I hope that the relationship with Israel contributes to unleashing a lot of that talent. And so I would not be surprised if we have other investments in the region before long.
Yeah, if I could just add one more comment, right? I guess my hope is that it can become an integrated ecosystem, right? Where we can build on the strengths of both markets, right? I think one of the reasons like Israeli companies look global is, it's a smaller domestic market, right? And maybe the UAE can be an entry point into, or a conduit into the Gulf, right? That you can now have a meaningful business, in the GCC as well, right? And vice versa, right? I think companies here can learn how to go global, and hopefully that, that catalyst of capital and of like independent conviction from VCs can help. I mean, VCs here can learn from it too, right?
Fantastic.
Fantastic, JD. So as we say in Israel, inshallah. So from your mouth to God's ears. So thank you. Moving now over to Krista. Krista, what are your insights into the UAE business culture? And we heard from Stephen before about more the technical side of setting up a business in UAE. What are some of the cultural tips you would give the audience? It's on mute.
Let me share a bit of a laundry list with you, and starting with the positives. After 15 years of experience as an Australian in this region, the first thing is you're going to see every nationality in the UAE, and that's from an employment standpoint, but also because of the major efforts over 20 plus years to attract FDI, you're also going to find most of the world's Fortune 500 companies. I would say expect a very high degree of tolerance. We actually have a government ministry for that, and respect for difference. What you can also find here is decisive action. The UAE has been built on vision and decisive execution. Look at the country's response to COVID as a great example of that. You will also see a very noticeable openness, as Mike picked up on, to networking that I've only ever seen really done as well in a few countries. There's a sense of excitement about the business community here being able to connect with Israel. We're kind of leaning in and excited to see what the possibilities are. One thing that I think is worth noting is that there's a large expat community, and there are very strong business support groups. So if you're looking to kind of rapidly mobilize and, get your feet on the ground and become part of the business community, there are some fantastic business support groups, country groups, industry groups, groups like Entrepreneurs Organization, for example. overall, you're going to feel a very empowering positivity. This is about positive perception and sentiment. And of course, in recent years, if you think about sort of the Fortune 500s, what we've also seen is the emergence of the tech sector, sort of innovation, this exciting new way forward that has led to a more eclectic, informal approach, I would say, to the business culture. Let me very briefly talk about some of the challenges. Let's be balanced about this. Despite the desire for innovation and adoption of innovation, that doesn't quite yet match the reality. So if we look on the positive side, that leaves a very big opportunity for tech business to come in and, you know, address some of the bureaucratic sort of paper-based processes. And it does take a lot of tenacity to follow up and get things done. And I think Stephen will probably talk a little bit more about that. Expats should also be aware of emiratization policies, particularly if they plan to take government jobs. And while some expats may sort of avoid criticising government services because of, you know, that they fear somehow that is unacceptable, actually, in my experience of the culture here, that is more perception than reality. There's actually a great openness to wanting to improve, wanting to innovate, wanting to transform and grow trade. And, you know, Mike, you've talked about that feeling of openness and that, you know, any topic of conversation is allowed. And my advice would be that's actually the reality. But sometimes when people come in from overseas, they have a perception that it won't be that way. And that can be almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I hope that's helpful.
So that's great. And I'll look up the Ministry of Tolerance. Sounds fascinating. And it's a national sport in Israel to criticize the Israeli government. Once we're all patriotic, it's a national pastime. But thank you. Over to Guy.
We also have a Minister for Happiness, I should mention.
Okay, there you go. There you go. That's terrific. So Guy, over to you in Sydney. Can you tell us a bit about your experience being part of the Australian government landing pad, and just describe that sort of in short? And as we're talking about ecosystems, how does the Australian ecosystem compare to Israel in your eyes?
Sure. So I think if we touch on ecosystems first, one of the reasons we're actually attracted to go to Israel was the Australian government has this program where you can choose a number of different ecosystems globally for startups. And Israel we went to for two key reasons. One was access to capital, just more mature market. There's a lot more VC funds which are international or domestically based out of Israel compared to, say, Australia. The scene in Australia has changed probably in the last couple of years, but there's definitely a lot more access to capital and domain knowledge in Israel. Also access to talent. So I think one of the key reasons we went to the landing pad was we weren't at the stage where we wanted to kind of scale our business. It was more around R&D and kind of investing into the technology and product. So we went to Israel to experience the landing pad program, which gave us about 90 days in a co-working space. We get attached to someone called a super connector, and they can literally open doors to any company, any firm or VC in Israel. And that was just a really interesting experience for us. But it also taught us to kind of think with that cultural mindset of how Israelis deal with things and how they do business. And it's fast. You know, in Australia, whereby you might go have a coffee and a half an hour meeting, Israel's like 15, 20 minutes, not even a glass of water can be offered sometimes. And at the end of it, it's like, are we doing a deal? Are we doing business? So that was probably, took us a few meetings to learn that and to get, to kind of get that across. But it helped us in setting up our operations in Israel. And just having the opportunity at the place we're based is called SOSA. It's basically a co-working value creation space where, you know, every week or every month you get an email about, you know, a top VCs coming through or a big corporate companies coming through, and you can just book 15, 20 minutes with them. So you actually had access to experts in the space, whether they're VCs or corporates, and it could be a partnership opportunity, or it could be an opportunity to pitch your business or tailor your pitch and learn about that market. And that was just something that we hadn't really experienced in this ecosystem in Australia, as opposed to like sending a cold LinkedIn message. So that was kind of one of the key reasons that drew us to Israel. Ecosystem difference, I think in Israel, everyone's kind of used to working for a startup or, you know, wants to work for a startup. So I think that was also the mindset shift was to attract talent was a lot easier, especially in engineering and product and a couple of the key roles we were looking at. Also, the mindset of Israel is, I think JD touched on this before, it's think global, right? A lot of Australian startups and businesses focus on our region, or they focus on Australia, whereas Israel doesn't really build much locally. They pretty much export everything. And we've seen, our business change from majority of an Australian customer base to being about 85% US and EU and UK. And Israel is such a great spot to launch off because you have access to those markets. So those are a couple of the kind of key insights that we saw.
Thanks, Guy. We're really excited about the future of my interview, this Australia-Israel Access. It's really, really terrific. Christo, I had a look at your website and saw some of the things that you work on and research. It was really interesting. But one thing I want to ask your insights is the future of work, especially remote working, in this Corona era. I'd love to hear your views on that. Just mute again, sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm off. If you don't mind, Paul, what I'd actually really like to quickly do is to share a couple of tips for setting up businesses. So, I previously led the largest free zone in the UAE, but there are about 40 in total. And, Stephen highlighted businesses need to be well prepared to carefully choose their jurisdiction. And, I know we're probably running short on time, so I just wanted to share a couple of tips on that first.
Sure.
There's a lot of choice and quite a few steps. So, and although some regulators have taken significant steps to simplify the process, it can still be complex. I would say always think about your strategy for growth when you're choosing where to set up. You want to choose a location that is just as viable and helpful today as it is in 5 years' time. Think not just about the regulations, but also think about the degree to which that regulator is creating an ecosystem and a business community that is going to help you to be successful. And as Guy talked about, this kind of notion of super connectors, in the UAE, the regulator also plays the role of kind of, trade connector and facilitator and support mechanism. You would probably be well advised to talk to, a firm like Clyde & Co about, the ease of setting up a bank account with the various different jurisdictions. That can be a sticking point. And, although you can set up a company yourself and kind of do the DIY route, my advice would be to engage a company setup advisor. Super quickly then on the future of work, which was actually your question. Look, there are many initiatives now in the UAE to open up visas to contingent and freelance workers. And if the future of work is characterised by sort of flexibility and choice and adoption of innovation, then the UAE is very much aware of that, although facing some teething problems. Greater access to communication has come at, the cost over many years of being restricted, for example, in being able to access voice over IP. COVID has actually changed that for the better. What we're also seeing is the banking system digitising faster than ever as workers expect to be able to do everything remotely. And organisations in the UAE are very much catching up with the rest of the world in terms of use of technology for their employees who are working from home. One of the things that everybody sort of needs to be aware of, and Stephen talked about this sort of the current versus the future, regulators still require businesses to have a physical footprint. And in some cases that results in sort of a cost burden that may not be necessary. Now, what I think is that the move through COVID to the adoption of working from home and comfort with working from home is going to really catalyse regulators to recognise that which is normal in the rest of the world also needs to be wholeheartedly adopted in the UAE. So I foresee that coming, but it's not quite here yet. And we're also seeing a lot of progress from Smart Dubai. It's a government department responsible for smart cities, really working hard on integrating citizen services and, reducing the reliance on employers to almost sort of take on a parental role for employees. This is a very important change when we are looking at the ability for workers to freelance, to take on the work that they want to take on in any organisation that they want to work with, which has been very difficult in the past when, as a worker, you are tied to one organisation who provides you with a visa for 3 years. So I know that's a lot of information to take on board, but these are some of the considerations that business leaders need to be aware of in terms of the future of work in the UAE. I hope that's
Thanks, Krista. No, really interesting, and the free trade zone as well is something that Israel's been looking at to develop itself, and it looks like UAE has got it right. So thank you for that. Back to you, Guy. We just have a few more questions before we wrap the session up. So Guy, can you talk a bit about the investment you got from Aleph VC and how significant is that? And also my interview talks about making the recruiting experience enjoyable again. Can you also elaborate on that, please?
Sure. So I think Krista touched on the future of work, and that essentially is my interview, right? But I think, Jaydeep had a really good point around, as an entrepreneur and a founder, you can get access to capital, but you also want to get access to domain expertise, and you want to get access to people that can actually help the business. You want to hire people or bring on partners who are smarter than yourself and have done this before. And I think, that's what's really significant about the fundraising with Aleph. They're a fantastic VC firm in Israel, probably one of the best, and they bring a heap of domain expertise and knowledge to businesses at our stage where we want to scale. And how they do this is they've got a whole internal team, from sales to marketing to design to engineering, for example, that actually lend their expertise to us at various stages, and they've done this before. So I think that's something that we as a team looked for in a VC, and that's why it's such a fantastic opportunity to work with them, and we're really, really looking forward to it, but also helping us take our business into the next phase. Around how we make recruiting experience and how we make that enjoyable. So our company values play, and everyone, I think, knows that recruiting always can sometimes have a bit of a negative connotation to it, right? Whether it's reviewing CVs, whether it's having to go to interview candidates, or from the flip side where we experienced it, candidates applying for so many jobs. So we want to make it that they can do it anywhere, anytime for candidates. We want to make sure that it can be, they don't have to travel across town, they don't have to jump onto Zoom calls, and do 15 different Zoom calls a day. So we want to make sure the experience, the interface is great for candidates coming through, and they get the opportunity to put their best foot forward and explain why they might want to work for a company or demonstrate knowledge and experience. On the flip side, though, you also want to make it enjoyable for businesses, for teams to actually review applications. And you can do this through, collaborating inside the product. You can do this through sending shortlists across to different team members, and actually make hiring really fun and engaging. And I think that's the part, it needs to be engaging. And that's a part that we bring to the table. And what I'd recommend is if people want to check out the product, we've got a freemium model as well. Sign up, check out the future of work, and come and say hi, and let's play.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Guy. I'm going to log in and have a look at it myself. So if I can just quickly whip over to Stephen. Now, this is an impossible question to answer in a couple of minutes. However, what would be your key considerations for any business that is looking to enter the UAE market? Impossible to answer quickly, but if you can, your best 3 points.
I shall do my very best. I think some of the points that Krista made around practicalities and being aware of the opportunities and also the challenges are really good. I would kind of boil it down into 3 tips, really. One is where are my target clients? Where is my target market? Because that will influence your setup. Second is do your due diligence on your potential partner. And we have a great example between Jaydeep and Mike, and how Manev and Phoenix obviously have a fantastic relationship, but you need to make sure that the relationship that you're getting yourself into is exactly what you expect. And the third piece of advice is don't sign anything without getting a lawyer to look at it, because unfortunately I've seen some scenarios which haven't played out so well in favor of the foreign party. So just beware.
Thanks, Stephen. That's great advice. And we'll lift the best till last. We had a few people asking, why isn't Anna getting a chance to speak? But Anna, can you talk a bit about the Israeli property tech scene and Pearl Collins' connection to the ASX? And thank you so much.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Paul. Okay, so going back to what Guy said, that Israelis expect to do business in 20 minutes. There's one word that I always say that can be translated neither to English, Russian, or any other language, and it's tachlis. Tachlis in Hebrew is the most concise bottom line. And yes, I do believe that Guy is correct that we always aim to tachlis. And I'm not going to tell you about my 26 years in the high-tech arena or in the Ministry of Defense of Israel or anything like that, because we have enough attorneys on the line as we do. I'm just going to say that we think that the arena of the PropTech zone is the most interesting arena at this point to cooperate between Israel and the Emirates. I myself am a mentor in a few high-tech hubs and accelerators. And one of them is the PropTech zone. It's an accelerator it's the first Israeli accelerator for PropTech technologies. And it's exciting because all it does, it puts the startups and the real estate players in the same arena, trying to really make them meet today's needs of the industry. Because I think that this arena of the PropTech is not developed enough, not nearly as it should be. As an example, I would send you all a link later on to everyone to one of the technologies that we found really disruptive and amazing here in Israel. And what I would like to do with the short time that I have is really call out for any kind of cooperation that we can do between this arena, the real estate arena, and any high-tech kind of way. I mean, we can do an accelerator, we can do exchange of needs or startups or so on. I would like to do tachlis. So if anyone, it can be Stefan or Guy or anyone that has any interest in real estate and would like to touch base and see how can we cooperate in exchange the requirements. And I think that just one thing about being a lawyer, I think that our role here is not to write the perfect documents. Our role here is to build the real bridge between the two nations, which have very different, as it was stated, legal environments, and make things really happen, make the transaction happen. This is what we're doing with the ASX and with the financing transaction between Australia and Israel. And this is what we hope to do here. So forget the legal for a second. We will be happy, both Micha and I, to hear about the real requirements and issues that bother you in any I mean, it can be real estate, it can be any other industry of interest to build that bridge and make a transaction. That's it.
Great. Carl, do you want to wrap it up?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much, Anna. So just to close out today's session, I want to say a big thank you to Paul and his team for helping put this together. Lightning speed, we were able to get this one up and running, and we look forward to future seminars so we can exchange information between the two markets. I'd like to thank all of our speakers today for joining and making an informative session. I think we've had a good broad base of not just commercial operations, but the legal background and some sound advice for any companies that are looking to jump on the opportunity and head in either direction. And I would like to thank all attendees for jumping on today. Please reach out to any of the speakers direct and throw in the LinkedIn invite. Hopefully it doesn't get swamped in our Israeli colleagues' inboxes. But definitely say reach out and let's make sure we take up the opportunity. What's really exciting to hear is just between Mike, Maniv and Jaideep with Phoenix is that we've got not just a soundbite of an opportunity here, but actually investments already occurring. So it's fantastic to see, and I'm sure we're going to see more of it. As a final note from my side, just in terms of the UAE business environment, the token tagline this year has definitely been open for business. I think the UAE has handled COVID very well. There's been a careful balancing of protection over the citizens on top of making sure businesses don't suffer excessively. And I have to say, living and working here, it's not been bad. We have had full lockdown. I think it was needed. but generally we have been able to go to restaurants and live a fairly normal-ish life. They adapted quickly, and they now actually offer remote working visas, which was a fantastic move forward. This time of year, it's great to take it up. 6 months from now, maybe not so much when it's around the 50-degree mark. But one thing about the UAE is it's not as technologically developed as many other countries. The tradition here has always been to use labour, as it's so cheap, instead of looking at technological solutions. So for Israeli companies with a very tech-savvy ecosystem, I think there are going to be a load of opportunities, as any business has learned through COVID that you need to be efficient and you need to adapt technology into the business to really keep ahead. If you don't, you'll be lost within the next 12, 24 months. The UAE is definitely not so much of an emerging market as it once was. So like Krista, being here about 14 years, Jaideep, best part of 24. There are quite a few expats that have called this place home for a long time. So with this in mind, reach out, go through the memberships between two organisations and touch base, because there needs to be an understanding of the laws and legislation of the land, but then how that thing gets applied on a ground level basis needs to be understood as well. So reach out, and I'm sure, especially myself and other members in the ABCD, would love to assist. We'll take you out, and I do believe, Jaideep, you had the Maniv team celebrating Hanukkah just last week.
Yes, we were very blessed to celebrate our first Hanukkah in Dubai. And yeah, I mean, like I said, there's great opportunity for collaboration, and we just have to get into action. Right? It can be done. It's been done.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Shadi. Paul, would you like to say any final words?
No, just thank you, Carl. Thanks, everyone. It's been a great session, and look forward to 2021 working together. So as we say, shalom and salam.